Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabby and the deputy editor of Spiked Online, Tom Slater. So a very good evening to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And the strikes against Syria dominate the front pages, as you would imagine. The Sunday Express there calls it a strike at the heart of evil, described by Theresa May and Donald Trump as a perfect mission. The Star has a similar headline, striking back at evil, it says, while the Mail on Sunday describes it as mission accomplished. But the Observer says that Theresa May is facing a backlash from MPs, angry that Parliament wasn't consulted first. The Sunday Mirror calls it May's Russian roulette as she waits for possible reprisals from President Putin. But the People says that America, Britain and France stand ready to strike again if necessary. The Sunday Telegraph quotes Donald Trump saying that America is locked and loaded for more attacks. The Sunday Times concentrates on the victims of Syria's chemical weapons attacks, picturing one little girl who survived the April the 7th attack. So let's talk through those headlines, as well as some of the stories inside as well, with Rachel Shabby and Tom Slater. No surprise that the Syrian attacks are dominating the front pages. You've picked out The Observer to kick off with, and they really go with the UK angle on this. They're suggesting that Theresa May will face a bit of a backlash in Parliament on Monday.
Completely. So, of course, Jeremy Corbyn has been leading the charge in terms of criticising these strikes, but also kind of across party. Beyond the Conservatives, Vince Cable making noises in relation to wanting to force a vote on this and discuss it. Also, obviously, it's already happened. But I think what's interesting at the moment is that the discussions that are being had, broadly speaking, are quite legalistic. There's this discussion about whether or not it should have been put before Parliament in the first place, as well as whether or not it breached international law. And I think my only concern in relation to that is that the broader issue with the strikes themselves gets clouded in a lot of kind of legalistic argument, because the fundamental... But
the legal side of it is important,
The legal side of it is important. I think, of course, the question of actually our democratic representatives having some sort of input on this is obviously crucial. This is not a case of Britain retaliating after coming under attack. This is effectively a foreign policy decision, and a pretty disastrous one at that. But I think in much the same way, rather, that, for instance, during Iraq, the Liberal Democrats' response, claiming to be the ones who were anti this, it was very much just focused on the legal question. I think the moral and political question is far more important. So in the Observer story, number 10 source is quoting as saying that Theresa May is confident in these strikes because their aim, as previously stated, is to prevent the normalisation of the use of chemical weapons. Putting to one side whether or not that is justified in this instance, what I'm far more worried about is the normalisation of these kinds of strikes, where it's not entirely clear that they're going to work. The people arguing for them aren't necessarily sure they're going to work. They risk further destabilising a very troubled part of the world, and all, it seems, for the reason of just making Western politicians feel better about themselves and feel as if they can sleep at night. And I think that's the far more concerning normalisation that we need to be talking about, and I hope that the debate in Parliament will start to reflect that.
Well, the other justification as well, aside from sending a message about the use of chemical weapons, not just to Syria but around the world, is also that sense of trying to save people in a dire humanitarian situation and not seeing another way of doing that.
Well, I found that even less plausible, to be honest with you. I mean, May did talk about that earlier today at Downing Street. Now, if you are concerned about if there is humanitarian concern, are you saying that another chemical attack is imminent? Well, we don't have any clear evidence of that. If you are concerned about the humanitarian aspect, then you should be trying your hardest to make sure that it is possible to get aid delivered into the region in humanitarian corridors that aren't then abused by Assad to do some population displacement. Those are the things you should be focusing on. And crucially, you know, people in the Ghouta area and around Idlib in Syria are desperately trying to leave the country, and they can't because the Syrian border has been blocked since 2015 with Turkey. Any kind of smuggling across that route has either been prohibitively expensive or is now becoming increasingly more difficult. It is striking to me that the three countries that have just launched these bombs in Syria are also the three countries that have taken in the least amount of Syrian refugees. If you really want to make a humanitarian intervention, those should be at the front and centre of your operation, and they clearly aren't with the UK.
But if you want to stop Assad carrying out chemical weapons attacks on his own people, what do you do if you don't carry out an action like this? How do you stop it?
But that was never part of the agreement with the prohibition of chemical weapons. It wasn't that you stop them by bombing a country every time it had launched a chemical weapons attack, because then what happens? That isn't even a deterrent, it's a punishment.
I mean, the other point that we have to sort of recognise here is that there is still no hard evidence about what actually happened on the ground here. And you don't have to be some kind of conspiracist to suggest that the facts aren't entirely clear. Now, of course, there are arguments about this idea of it being a deterrent, but I think the thing we have to recognise is how destabilised that country is and how mixed up things are. For instance, the rebels who are in control of Douma and that part of eastern Ghouta, the Army of Islam, have previously been accused in August 2016 by the YPG in Aleppo of firing bombs tainted with chlorine in relation to that thing. Now, that's not to suggest that that definitely proves that they were behind this attack. But if you create a situation, and the West effectively says, whenever there will be a chemical weapons attack, we will respond by bombing Assad, you do create an incentive to all the various rebel groups in various different regions with various different agendas, if they are in control of chemical weapons, even if it's on a smaller scale, to use them. It gives them cover in which to do that. And again, coming back to your point, which I think is important, about putting aside the principled case against Western interventionism, which is the argument that I think is most important, and one that I would like to make, purely if your interest is in making sure that this carnage isn't stirred up further, that that kind of vortex of competing interests, competing barbarisms that we're seeing in relation to Syria isn't escalated, then this course of action is not going to help.
I need to get some more papers in. Let's take a look at the front page of the Mail. They focus on Donald Trump's declaration today. He used the words mission accomplished, a phrase, of course, we heard from George Bush in the past.
It's a weird decision to use this phrase, given how unaccomplished the mission actually was when Bush declared that, as you say, over the Iraq War, and you know the devastation and the carnage and the catastrophe that befell that country after mission was declared to have been accomplished. But I think it is indicative of what the US, the limits of what they wanted to do. I mean, this really was just, you know, this is one strike. It'll send a message to Assad that he can't do this again, even though we really should have garnered some kind of international consensus over that, not because we doubt that Assad did it, but because that is just
although the
protocol.
Reaction since internationally has been broadly positive in terms
of... not from the UN, it hasn't been. I mean, the UN has been quite critical about the fact that this happened without going through the channels. And, yeah, it is really tedious and frustrating. And, of course, all the evidence does point to it being from Assad. And certainly it won't be the first time that it has happened. But, yes, there are international things that need to be gone through that didn't happen. And if you're going to accuse a country of flouting international law, then it helps if you don't also do the same. But it does suggest that Trump, who, let's not forget, only a week ago was saying that he wanted to pull out completely, he wanted the US to pull out completely from Syria, it does suggest that he doesn't really have much of a plan or an end game in mind to bring this devastating situation to an end.
Well, let's bring in the front page of the Sunday Telegraph then, because they use Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN's phrase, locked and loaded, implying as a kind of warning to Syria, if there were to be another attack, a chemical weapons attack, they are prepared to do the same again. That's the suggestion, isn't it?
Well, completely. It's also the suggestion of the way in which they carried out this attack. It was very pointed. I think it was basically double the attack that was laid out almost a year ago after the alleged chemical weapons attack.
Double the number of missiles.
Double the number of missiles after the attack in Khan Sheikhoun. This implies that there will be further escalation further down the road. And so whilst we've had Theresa May saying that this is not about regime change, this is not about us getting caught up in this conflict further, the implication of everything that they are doing is that this will have to escalate and escalate in order to get to their achieved goals. And what's interesting about this story, just quickly, sorry, is the fact that we've also got Lieutenant General Kenneth Mackenzie admitting effectively that this attack, of course, will... the Assad regime, such as it is capability in relation to chemical weapons, won't really be touched by this. And I think that really gets to the heart of, as Rachel was saying, the lack of clear plan on this. And whilst Trump, in terms of his Twitter brandishments and talking about mission accomplished and bragging about the size of his missiles, etc., I just feel like he's, in many respects, a far more degraded version of how Western foreign policy in relation to this part of the world has been going for decades now, which is effectively, it's all just about the West's narcissism. It's about whether or not Trump can feel like he's the big man with the big rockets, or in terms of liberal interventionists, it's about them feeling like even if it destroys everything, we
Although,
must do something.
to be fair, that's pretty much how every other agent in Syria is looking at Syria. That's not just a Western thing. Every country that is involved in Syria at the moment is doing it for its own reasons, not for the Syrian people.
OK, we must take a break, I'm afraid. Plenty to talk about after the break, including could a cross-party effort allow the public a say on the terms of a Brexit deal? We'll be talking about that and lots more when we come back. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Rachel Shabby and Tom Slater. And we're going to go back to the issue of the strikes on Syria. At the front page of the Sunday Times leads with it, but it's actually their second story that you wanted to focus on now. And the question of whether or not Russia, obviously a keen ally of President Assad, is likely to retaliate over these attacks.
Yeah, and according to this story, Theresa May has received intelligence risk assessments that say that Putin could retaliate with compromat. So that would be revealing compromising material on members of the Conservative cabinet, and in retaliation for the military strike. And the other thing that comes up in this piece is that one of the things that Theresa May is preparing to do is to order a crackdown on Russian oligarchs in London, saying that cronies of Putin could face further economic sanctions. Now, that to me seems a sensible thing to do. Anyway, you know, if Putin is bankrolling Assad, if he is, you know, the financier of these horrendous assaults on Syrian people, then pressuring that financial tap seems to me in itself a really good way of escalating pressure on Russia to change that.
But it will be fascinating to see what Russia's next move is, and some people who were nervous about the idea of strikes were worried for that reason, that it could draw Russia and America and Britain into a wider kind of conflict. The fact that there appear to have been no casualties, as far as we understand at present, no Russian casualties in particular, because they'd promised to retaliate, does that minimise the chances of some kind of action by Russia, do you think?
Well, I think, of course, now, at the present moment, it's quite clear that despite a lot of the bellicose rhetoric on both sides, insofar as the Russia's ambassador to Lebanon previously talking about not only blowing up Western missiles, but actually the source of those missiles, which is a straightforward act of war, and then Trump dutifully responding in kind. I think and it's also worth noting, of course, that the hotline between Western forces and Russia maintained throughout this attack to make sure that certain targets weren't hit. But I think we need to recognise how conflicts like this escalate. And I think when the Secretary-General of the UN said yesterday that the Cold War is back with a vengeance, I think it won't take much for that Cold War to become a hot war, and everything around this conflict is leading towards a situation in which you could see fire returned on both sides, and that would be particularly catastrophic. OK, and let's, on the same kind of subject, inside the Sunday Express, you've spotted a story about Britain's reaction and its feelings about Russia in the wake, presumably, of the Salisbury attacks. I don't know if they've done any kind of polling since last night's attacks, but certainly the sense of how Britons feel about Russia. Completely. So this is the Comres survey for the Sunday Express, which says 2/3 of Britons think Russia is a force for evil in the world. And, of course, now this is, particularly after the Salisbury attack, is obviously a key part of the debate. The one thing that concerns me is particularly this kind of reference to Russia as evil, trying to kind of resurrect the idea of the evil empire. And I think beyond this poll, I think the way in which this is playing out politically, I think there is a tendency from people in both of the main parties, the desire to kind of reheat the Cold War effectively and to treat Russia as this evil being. Now, it's not to say that the Russian state doesn't do terrible things, but nevertheless, I think the way in which all of these issues are kind of escalated is not very positive. That being said, the one thing that's interesting in this, and the one thing that we shouldn't forget, is that they also asked in relation to the airstrikes whether they were in support, and only 29% of people polled said they were in support, and that's actually fair higher than some of the other polls that have come out, and it just
that was ahead of the strikes.
Ahead of the strikes, yes, exactly. And I think that, again, just shows the chasm on that particular issue exists between people and what the government is actually doing.
OK, we probably ought to crack on with our Brexit story because we said we'd talk about it. So let's move on, if that's all right, Rachel.
Yeah.
To Inside the Mail on Sunday, give us a people's vote on Brexit deal. Who's saying this?
Yeah, they've got an interview with Anna Soubry and Chuka Umunna, who have got this sort of cross-party, pro-Europe alliance going on, which this interview refers to as a Labour Conservative double act. They are asking, they have a campaign for a people's vote. They don't want another vote on staying or leaving the EU. They want to vote on the deal that Theresa May comes back to Parliament with. And there does seem, to be fair, to be some kind of popular support for that. That position does have public approval. It does seem the case that people do want a vote on the terms.
Based on what?
But then it doesn't become clear what happens after that. So if the terms are rejected, does Theresa May just keep negotiating until we get a vote that Parliament and the people approve of?
Well, I've seen no evidence to suggest that people are actually... There's appetite for a second referendum. And I think this particular campaign is just an exercise in remarkable cynicism and kind of doublespeak. To call this...
There isn't appetite for a second referendum. There's appetite for a vote on the deal. Those are two different questions.
Well, it depends if you... I think the second referendum on the deal is being pushed explicitly as a means through which you could keep Britain in the European Union by the back door, because the option of staying in the EU is what they're pushing.
I'm just saying that there is polling. There is a polling difference. So people do support a referendum on the deal, but not on having another referendum.
Now, there is a question in relation to particularly Best for Britain and also various other sort of campaign groups and the way in which this is worded in order to push for it. But again, ever since the Brexit vote, in terms of the polling data in general, has shown that even people who vote for Brexit who didn't vote for Brexit, rather, just want it to be gotten on with. And I think, again, this kind of second referendum campaign is very much consigned to the very elite anti-Brexit layer who, despite their calls for a people's vote, wished we'd never had a vote in the first place. So I think it's incredibly duplicitous.
They're not to be confused with the elite Brexit layer, who are not at all elite.
No.
OK, we are out of time. We will leave it there.
And it's one of those days when there is really only one story on all the front pages, albeit given very different treatment. Here's the Mail on Sunday. Trump, mission accomplished, but also pointing out that Theresa May's got some trouble ahead over not calling that Commons vote. There's the Sunday Telegraph, the British warplane glaring at its leaders, and the later Trump comment, locked and loaded. There's the Sunday Times. They have a really, really good old-fashioned piece of reportage here by Louise Callahan. She has found and interviewed the family of the girl who you saw frothing at the mouth in the original photograph, which in many ways started this whole thing off, and the stench of chlorine in her clothes she talks about, and much more. And also a story there suggesting the Russians are going to hit back by releasing lots of dirty tricks at the British elite, which should be great fun if it happens. The Observer there, May faces anger over the Syria raids, looking at the political fallout. And then finally, I could go on and on, but I won't. There's the Sun, gone in 120 seconds, it says. Assad's chemical weapons programme has been set back 2 years by just 2 minutes of British and American and French strikes. So an awful lot to talk about. Christiane, let's start with you. As I said, you have interviewed President Assad in the past. You know Syria quite well. Front page of the Sunday Times is where you wanted to start.
Well, I do think this is important. You mentioned a good old-fashioned piece of reportage, and it's really important to get to right at the ground and granular level about this kind of story and not just look at it from 30,000 feet up. These are the victims of this man, and they have been for the last 7 years, with conventional war and weapons and with chemical weapons. And we shouldn't forget that these people are being aggressed on a daily basis by this man. And I have interviewed him, and many of you remember when he first came to power, believed that he would be the young reformer of the Middle East.
He's married to a nice British ophthalmologist and all the rest of it.
And of course, then we have the Arab Spring. Why was it okay for the Egyptians to rise up and get rid of their dictator, who did much less to his people than Assad, and somehow it's not okay for the Syrians to want some kind of reform. That's what started this war.
So you think that was when he changed as a person, or he flicked back to the old Assad?
From what I have heard from people who grew up with him, who know him, who, yes, he was the younger son, he wasn't the heir, he came accidentally because his brother was killed, but he, like his brothers and his father, were born ruthless. And it never changed, and he was always like that.
Let's just go back. You talked about the granular detail of what happens. I think the important thing about this report by Louise Callaghan is that she's down in the... She talks about being in the basement.
Yes.
You're cowering in a basement, and suddenly you hear these strange popping noises from above, and you go out to look at it, and it's gas. And the terror and all the strength in your body kind of flows out, and you stumble and you fall. It's the actual detail of what a gas attack is like.
And it's really important to know that, because let's face it, in 1925, there was the International Convention Against Chemical Weapons. And Saddam Hussein, of course, he did it. He was the first. But Bashar Assad, for 7 years, has been doing this with impunity, and he's normalized the use of chemical weapons. Do we want to live in that kind of world? Do we?
The other reason this is so important is that Russia will always deny it, Assad will always deny it. So how do you demonstrate that chemical weapons were used? Now, when the United Nations have done this, they've documented something like 30 or 40 attempts by Assad using chemical weapons. You need to put people on the ground to talk to the survivors, to have them describe, to see if their accounts corroborate. And the Sunday Times has done this.
The stench of chlorine in this
exactly.
But not just that, blood samples, urine samples, they've done a good deal of homework, the Sunday Times and the New York
thanks to this report, there can be really no doubt now that chemical weapons were used, and also that Assad's regime is the only outfit capable of using them, and that was in doubt only a few days ago. So I think the Sunday Times has really moved the story on.
And there's a great, we should just mention, since it's in front of us there, a great cartoon.
Yeah, I think there have been thousands of words written about this today, but none of them captures it so eloquently as Morton Moreland's illustration in the Sunday Times.
You should say he's just pressing send.
He's got Donald Trump on the head of an aircraft carrier pressing send, lots of missiles behind him, which perfectly sums up the kind of limited attention span. This cropped up in Fox News, therefore he's angry, he's going to click some missiles, and after that it'll be on to something else. So this is a kind of ballistic Twitter storm, if you like, and he won't, I don't think, do much follow-up.
On to something else, Rachel, because the other question is what happens next, and there's lots and lots of big spreads about, you know, international reaction and what's going to happen next. But you've chosen the Observer there, a whole range of different international leaders, the Iranians, I can see, Assad, the Russians, the Americans, British, the French, and so on.
Yeah, there are. This is an In Focus piece looking at the international ramifications and how dangerous is this moment is the question. Look, I understand why the international community has a red line over chemical weapons, but equally, it seems that the message that has been sent with this very limited missile attack from the US, the UK and France is, well, Assad, you can't kill your own people with chemical weapons, but you can carry on killing them with cluster bombs, barrel bombs, and you can torture them to death. And that being the case, I don't understand why we would take this measure without going through international processes and protocol, which painstakingly, I'm afraid, does mean allowing weapons inspectors to do their job, as they were sent to do this weekend. Even if overwhelmingly we believe that Assad was responsible, we still have to go through this international protocol, because otherwise,
would you say there's reasonable doubt right now?
Because otherwise, what we are saying to every rogue state and every brutal dictator is, go ahead and flout international law. We don't care. We just did. And that is the dangerous problem internationally.
If you wait months to retaliate?
I'm not saying wait months, and I'm not even suggesting that this kind of retaliation is productive. Look, there are only two ways that this is going to end. One is all-out war, and that means more countries, ground troops, escalation, could take years, certainly more Syrians will die. That is one route, and the other route is a political process. And if you want the political process, then this has just set that political process back.
Would you say the political process has got my chance of succeeding?
It's the only way.
Can I just
give
you a slightly different view?
It's just a question of how many people need to die before.
First of all, it's really important to take note. It's clear that this is a very emotional subject and a very political subject. It's clear that those who may have been killed inadvertently were warned. The Russians were not engaged, and even by the Syrian report themselves, almost nobody was killed, if anybody. They report 3 injuries. It's really important to remember that. It's really important to look at the precision, at the length of time. This is not a war. This is a strike to stop a violation of international law.
So the question then, however, is...
And not everything is Iraq, and not everything works by hands off. Do no harm has created more harm in Syria.
But if we... Sorry, just for a second. If we warned the Russians, and they presumably warned Assad, because we know that he moved some of his jets into Russian hangars, he presumably moved his chemical weapons or some of them as well.
I don't think you can move all that stuff.
In which case, how can we say that it was successful?
You can't move all that stuff.
If you look, the New York Times today has got a story where they quote the military saying, actually, he probably did move his stuff from there. Since 2013, he's been quite good at hiding this. Therefore, we have not taken out his ability to use chemical weapons.
Is that the story you've got there?
Yes, this is right here. They've got a whole sort of selection of stories precisely about that. Mission accomplished. Well, what is the mission? What about how much this has been... Yes, very unfortunate, given the Iraq reference and George W. Bush, very unwise phrase to use. But to me, it seems, having covered a lot of these, from the first Gulf War to the constant attacks on Saddam Hussein over his use of WMD, including chemical, and his building of nuclear. This is way before the 2000 invasion. I mean, I've been in Baghdad watching cruise missiles flying for many, many years. And then in Bosnia, genocide, there was a US and British and French-led intervention. And in Kosovo, it stopped the horror. It stopped the horror. It's important to remember that. Here, we have to see whether this is a message that Bashar Assad and his patrons will listen to and hear.
But if we're talking about the message we should send to his patrons, and I agree with you about that, then why would you not pursue other means, political means, sanctions?
They've tried. The Russians have vetoed everything.
Not nearly enough.
And sanctions. They've tried.
By the way, there was...
For years. But they wouldn't even let the OPCW go.
I'm talking about political pressure. I'm talking about financial pressure, which is now starting to work.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving through the papers.
But let's just not forget that they've attacked your own country with nerve gas, too.
Moving through the papers
we can forget that.
and looking at the political reaction in this country, Rachel, because there's lots of opinion polling being done.
Yeah.
And it's not terribly helpful to Theresa May right at the moment.
Not terribly helpful. The Daily Mail has this looking at the latest polling, which shows that voters disapprove of the airstrikes, but also think Theresa May was wrong to order those strikes without the MP's backing. 54% say she was wrong to do so. And then in terms of her ordering future strikes without MP's backing, that goes up. 61% say no, she shouldn't do that. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Parliament tomorrow, because it does seem there is cross-party opposition to her having taken this measure without going to Parliament first.
Well, I'm going to be talking about that with both of my main guests later on. I'd like to move to a few other stories. There's big coverage in the Observer today about the BBC's controversial decision to broadcast Enoch Powell's original Rivers of Blood speech, with lots of commentary around it. You heard it went out last night.
I did. I was listening, actually, as I was getting ready to go to bed early and come here this morning. But so it was absolutely fascinating to hear it, and chilling. Very chilling. I'm not sure how much analysis and context was put around it, and I know it's controversial for the BBC to have played it. But by the same token, it's a real reminder of actually what was said, what a horrendous division it created.
And what didn't happen.
That, and also, of course, in the context in the United States and here, the whole rise of the tragedy and the controversy and the outrage of entrenched racism.
Fraser, we're going to be hearing in a little while from Sir Patrick Stewart, the eminent actor, about this People's Vote campaign for a referendum on the outcome of whatever negotiations are concluded by Theresa May over Brexit. You've got the same story there, again, in the Mail on Sunday with Anna Soubry, Chuka Amuna, who've been on the sofa together here.
That's right. Well, they're continuing their power dynamic here, both giving the case for a people's vote. I'm not quite sure what they call the first referendum on Brexit, but the second one would be a people's vote. And it's interesting to see, whether Brexit is actually creating some new political dynamic, whether aspects of left and right who might come together here. But other than a couple of MPs agreeing with each other, you don't really see a wider public opinion shifting. Yes. I mean, most people, even those who voted against Brexit, opinion polls say that they'd quite like it to happen. They respect the result of the first referendum.
There's money gone in, there's new party political names being put out there, there's various launches, and nothing much seems to have happened.
No, you see politicians, you see actors, you see very rich backers, but you do not see a public groundswell of opinion. The country is roughly split evenly, as it was at the time. So given that public opinion hasn't really changed, I'm not quite sure why anybody thinks a second referendum, given that the first question gave the wrong answer, is really going to work. But, you know, what can we say? I admire them for trying.
Well,
Rachel.
yeah, I mean, I would just say, to be fair, in terms of public opinion shifting, there does seem to be growing support for a referendum on the deal. Certainly no one wants to see a rerun of the actual referendum in-out. But over the terms of the deal, there does seem to be
would that not be in-out?
Growing support for whether there should be a referendum on the actual deal that Theresa May
That would be in-out, wouldn't it?
No, I mean, not necessarily. It could just be go back and get a better deal, right?
Right, well...
Not easy for Theresa May anyway.
No.
Thank you all very much. We've covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much.
Let's take a look at what's leading the Sunday papers today. As expected, they are, of course, dominated by the strikes against Syria. Sunday Express, well, its headline, "A strike at the heart of evil." It says that Theresa May and Donald Trump have hailed it the perfect mission. The Mail on Sunday, we'll pop it. Yeah, we go. Mission accomplished, the words used by President Trump on Twitter yesterday, and I seem to recall another president at some point. However, the Sunday Telegraph suggests the strikes may not be over after Trump said last night that America is locked and loaded for more attacks if necessary. Trouble brewing for Theresa May at home after she ordered action without first consulting MPs. That's the story in the front of the Observer. And the Sunday Times concentrates on the victims of Syria's chemical weapons, picturing one little girl who survived the April 7th attack. Well, joining me to discuss all that, the Foreign Affairs writer Tim Marshall, political commentator Jane Merrick, and convener of Stop the War, Lindsay German. Lovely to see you all, guys. Tim, because you used to work here, let's go straight for your story, shall we?
Very kind.
Strangely enough, Syria has caught your attention today.
Yeah.
Did everything pretty much play out as people were expecting it?
Well, no, because there was some mild hysteria about World War III in the run-up to it. Not on this channel, I would hasten to add. So the people that expected World War III just didn't understand what was going on. I think people that follow the coded language that is used will not be surprised at what happened, which is why I wanted to start on this graphic.
This is the graphic from the Sunday Times.
But Sunday Times, simply because it was a double-page spread and it's quite sort of dramatic. But every single paper has got similar graphics. Now, some people criticise this sort of stuff as, oh, it's horrible warmongering, it's boys' toys. I think that's a little patronising to the amount of women that are involved in both the decision-making process and then the carrying out of whatever that decision is. But also, how else are you supposed to understand what happened when there's not that much footage? And also, when you know how to read this stuff, it tells you things. See, at the far left, point number 2 here. I mean, there's something in every single point, but point number 2, the RAF tornadoes swing north to an area outside of Syrian airspace. And that immediately tells you, we're not getting any pilots shot down on this, because that would absolutely raise the stakes of everything. And again, when you look at in the round, what happened was the Americans felt they had to have the red line, and it was crossed, and they were going to do something about it. The British and the French fell into line. They all calculated the Russians' pain threshold, and then they came in well underneath it, probably because of Mattis in the United States. So they came in well under the Russians' pain threshold. They rang up the Russians and said, you've got about we're not coming for you, but you've got about an hour to get out of the way, just in case you're somewhere we don't know about. They rang them up an hour afterwards and said, right, you can come out again now. So what was accomplished was the Russians get to rattle their sabres, but not have to do anything about it. The three powers get to underline what is the fundamental point of what happened, which is a red line about chemical weapons, and they can say, we did something about it, you're on notice, if you ever do it again, we will do it again. But finally, sorry, Neil, finally, Assad gets to carry on murdering his own people with barrel bombs, but maybe not with chemicals.
I mean, Lindsay, was it wrong for Donald Trump to declare this, you know, a red line, almost a strict liability test? If chemical weapons are used once again in Syria, we will take military action.
Well, I think what's wrong is not to oppose chemical weapons, which I think we all do, but to think that you can just take this kind of action, which I think is almost certainly illegal. If you look at international law, there are only really two conditions, self-defence and a UN resolution. Neither of those was present in this. I don't see what it's achieved. I think, as one politician described it recently, it's a gesture rather than a serious military operation. And what it's about is trying to, in the case of France, Britain and the US, making this stand, knowing that really it won't affect what's going on wider in the Middle East, which has huge implications, possibly for a future Third World War, to be quite frank.
Jen, I saw you shaking your head there.
I think it's really easy to get distracted by Donald Trump's tweets and his quotes about mission accomplished, and it's very easy to do that. But the point is, Assad caused this, not Trump. It was Assad's chemical attack in Douma last weekend which led to this response. And as Tim mentioned, the Mattis is the person who's worth listening to, because he is the one who thinks it's a one-off attack, and we have to send they had to send the Russians and the Syrians a message, and that was clearly that. I think Tim's laid out very clearly what the reasoning was, and we need to listen to Mattis. But in terms of legal backing, actually, they could have used, I mean, international lawyers have said this overnight, they could have used UN Security Council Resolution 2118, which was brought in after 2013, but they didn't need to do that because they have this forcible humanitarian action, which is a doctrine that's been used since the 90s in Sierra Leone.
You mean responsibility to protect?
Yes.
Yeah, but that does need UN sanction. It can't just be used in this kind of way. And unless there is an immediate threat, which there wasn't to actually, even in the situation in Douma, wasn't an immediate threat. So there's no real justification for it.
Hide behind the legality, which I agree with you is questionable and debatable. I agree with that. But RP2, responsibility to protect, if you're going to say, yes, I like that as a concept, but then you know the Russians will veto it every single time. What you're doing is hiding behind legality because you don't actually like action.
That isn't my only argument against this strike. And as you've just said, Tim, the Russians actually gave the coordinates in this particular attack. So the Russians were completely involved in this. It was they knew it was happening. Syria knew it was happening.
But just in terms of the legality, I mean, I think back to Kosovo. I mean, didn't the Independent Commission there rule that it was illegal, the intervention, but legitimate, because the diplomatic routes had been exhausted and there was an immediate threat to life, through which no other channel was there an opportunity.
That was a very, very controversial decision, though. And I mean, many people said that actually there were other channels.
But it was still the right thing to do.
And let's remember, in Douma, this is when the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, it's the day they'd actually gone into Douma. So why not wait and see what they decide?
5 days after the Russians went in there and cleaned everything up.
Well, I just think, I don't think this is helping with any of the things that we're talking about with the problems of the Syrian war, to tell the truth.
Well, just in terms, let's pick up on your story then, Lindsay, which is in the Mail on Sunday, and it is domestic reflection on taking military action. Richard Bergen was describing it as going to war. I don't think we're quite there yet. But it does certainly feel like the weight of public opinion, as things stand, is with the opposition benches and not with the government.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, certainly from the point of view of our campaigning, we've had people phoning off the hook. We've had Orkney, we've been told there's a demonstration tomorrow night. The demonstrations throughout the country against this. And that's a big change. And if you look at this opinion poll, it shows only 36% support the bombing raids, 40% against, so there's a majority against. 54% say it's wrong for May to have done it without going to Parliament. And I think that's going to be a very important debate.
Sorry to interrupt, Lindsay, but don't you think that that is because of, in one word, Iraq? And Iraq, in terms of a parallel example to what's happening in Syria, is not a particularly useful one?
Well, I think it's about Iraq in the sense that people don't trust prime ministers and politicians to do so, because they were taken into war on the basis of a lie, and therefore people are much more sceptical about evidence that is produced by the intelligence services and so on than they would have been probably 20 years ago. But obviously it's not comparable with Iraq, but I think people fear that the war in Syria is coming to an end. What does this mean for the future? What does it mean for Iran? What does it mean? Saudi and Israel are very much determined. We now have John Bolton as Secretary of State for Donald Trump, who is a hawk where Iran is concerned. So I think people are looking to the future as well as this immediate question.
I mean, one consequence, it appears from reading elsewhere in the papers this morning, is the Russians are now considering selling off that missile defence system. But in terms of confidence in our intelligence agencies, is there ever going to be an occasion in the next 50 years in which, MI5, MI6 tell the Prime Minister that something's going to happen, the Prime Minister tells the public something's going to happen, she needs to take action, and the public don't say, no, wait a minute, we want to see this intelligence as well?
I think it's extraordinary, actually, and obviously Iraq did have a huge impact in terms of the national psyche, but I think it's also ironic that actually Parliament did vote for the war in Iraq, so that's, if you want to sort of get caught up in legality, then there would be no legal problem with the war in Iraq, would there, because Parliament voted for it. And the thing is that
most of them think they were wrong to have done so.
Of course, but that's a separate issue. But the Parliament there is a convention established since 2003, but Theresa May didn't have to recall Parliament. I think politically it probably would have been sensible to do it on Friday, but she didn't have to do it. And I think, but talking about the intelligence agencies, I think it's extraordinary to hear Jeremy Corbyn and others sort of cast doubt about Salisbury. I just think that there is a confidence issue there. I trust the intelligence services and I trust what's going on in Salisbury, and I just think it's very strange for politicians, particularly the leaders of the opposition, to cast doubt in such a in a conspiratorial way.
You'll know, being steeped in politics, that tomorrow's a big day in Parliament.
Huge.
There was uniformity almost in most of the press today comes out in favour of what the action was taken. That's the media, not talking about the public necessarily. Where the papers diverge is this split about whether there should have been a vote or not. And in the poll that Lindsay's brought up, the second one, was Mrs May right to order strikes without MPs backing? Wrong, says 54%. I mean, there clearly is a debate to be had, and tomorrow in Parliament that debate will be had, and that will play out over a couple of days. And then I suspect the story will fade.
Jane, I thought I was going to have a week without Brexit, but no, you've stuffed that. Thank you. Mail on Sunday.
Apologise.
What are you thinking?
Tell us about this. A lovely picture, actually, of Anna Soubry and Chukwuemeka.
It is, and actually, I think on this, particularly with these two, it's a great example of where cross-party consensus on issues, huge issues facing the country like Brexit, are really important. That we've got so much divisiveness in British politics that it's really good to see two people like this come together. I mean, it's not just that, but the Lib Dems as well, come together and call for a people's vote, they're calling, on Brexit. I mean, they're trying to say this is not a second referendum, but I think good luck with that, because a lot of people will say that it is. But also, not just this cross-party alliance, this rally today, but we mustn't forget Brexit is always going on, despite what else is happening in the world. And this week, the House of Lords will start to go through the line-by-line amending the bill on the EU withdrawal, and I think that's really important because the government could face defeat there.
Lindsay, I presume, given the coalition has brought together disparate groups for one purpose, you welcome this, Tories, Labour, joining together?
I don't welcome this particular coalition. I think that a second referendum would be a political catastrophe in this country. I think it would lead to the growth of far-right parties.
Leave aside the politics of it for a second.
What, you mean whether Chukwuemeka and Anna Soubry can get on OK? Well, that's entirely up to them. But I think we need to look at it more seriously. Any second referendum, even if it reverses the decision, would be very similar margin, I think, a narrow margin for Remain or Leave. So, to me, I think we have to accept the decision, and then we have to talk about what kind of politics, what sort of society we want to build. And that's what Jeremy Corbyn and people are trying to do. I
mean, I don't know about you, Tim, but I set my watch these days by the creation or the talking about the creation of a new centre party to do something about Brexit.
The money's there, but the timing's wrong. There will not be a new centre party probably until after the next election. And then depending on how Labour do, if they fall apart catastrophically, the Corbyn days may be numbered and the moderates come back. If they win power, that's it, and then the centrist party comes. So we're a couple of years away. Briefly, I just want to say I agree with Jane about I do like to see a Tory and Labour coming together, because I do think that the social discourse, political discourse in this country has taken a sharp turn downwards, and it is very unhealthy for the body politic. I'd also say, I disagree with nearly everything that Lindsay ever says. I'm fundamentally opposed to nearly...
I'm sure you can't know about everything that I ever say.
But we haven't talked football yet. But
that'll be a short
But this is an example of, despite me fundamentally disagreeing with it, it is possible to have this discourse, and I do like this story, about only for that reason, because I just think the second referendum is just not going to happen, but people will also not stop trying to make it happen.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were looking for. This kind of love-in when we booked the
No, you weren't.
papers.
Because TV loves people shouting at each other.
And we used to employ you as well, Tim, yeah, for obvious reasons. Guys, thank you so much for coming in. Great stuff.